Alright everyone, so we're back at this section of Blender. We're going to be looking at setting up some lights, some cameras, rendering, and export settings. So to start with, let's take a look at what this scene looks like by default. So the material that's on here actually came to me with the file from the student, so kudos to you for figuring out how to set this up. It's actually a pretty cool material that has some nice transparency on it. Like I said, it's not necessary for you to include materials on your models, but if you want to, you're more than welcome to. So now what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to add in a floor plane. So let's just add in a plane here, like this. And then we have a light and a camera in our scene already by default. They were just hidden. So let's take a look at this light. Let's make sure we're also in cycles render, by the way. That'll change some settings if we're not. So once we have the light selected, we can actually check out the light settings in our properties manager over here. And we want to use an area light, so let's switch our lamp type from point to area light. And now you can see that it is angled in this direction and it has the qualities that we want now. I'm just going to switch this from rectangle to square, so I only have one parameter to deal with, I suppose. And I'm going to put this up to a size of 100. I know that seems kind of large. Don't worry, there's a reason for that. I'm also going to click Use Nodes, which will let us change the color and the strength of our light. I'm going to put this up to 5,000. And I know that's kind of huge, but don't worry. I'm actually I want this on 10, not 100. I will show you what 100 looks like later. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Now I'm just going to reposition the light. In fact, I want to open this up and zero out our rotation. So this is 0, 0, and this will be 90. So now on the Y, we should say 45. Nope, on the X, we should say 45, I should say. There we go. And so now we have it pointing in the correct direction. And we can move this up just a little bit. And now we can see what this is actually doing. So let's zoom in here and switch into our Shift Z mode, and that's actually not bad. We're getting a pretty good amount of light. We have some nice caustic reflections, which is just the light passing through our semi-transparent surface and then casting light to the other side of the plane. Shadows are nice and soft and diffused. So let me show you what it looks like if we use a light size of 1. So if our light is 1, you can see we don't get as nice of those reflections coming from the light because it's very tiny. You can see it reflected there. You can't actually see the light because it turns invisible. And the shadows become very harsh and well defined. So if you're looking for harsh shadows and very bright contrasting light in certain areas, then I would suggest using a small sized light with a very high intensity or strength. Again, if we put this back up to 10, you can see our shadows soften out. We get some of these nice reflections here, which are called specular hits or specular reflection on our bottle. And then if I switch this to 100 like I had initially intended to, you can see everything is super diffused. It's very dark. There's not a whole lot of contrast. If we crank this up by, say, 4 times, so what's cool is Blender will do math for us. So if we say asterisk 4, Blender will multiply that number. Let's multiply that by another 2. And you can see now that our entire scene is very diffused. It's very evenly lit. There are almost no shadows, just some very vague contact shadows, perhaps near the bottom here. But for the most part, if we want a very well evenly lit and diffused light, then we need a very large light with a very large strength. But for our purposes, we're going to go with a 10 size light, which we can see is overblown now because I need to reduce the strength of our light. And there, that should serve our purposes. This is some pretty natural lighting. For the most part, we might need to change the color to get it to be a little more natural, but this is a good amount of contrast. We're getting some soft shadows here. We're getting some nice and reasonably sized specular hits. So what I want to show you at this point is I want to show you ways that we can better control our lighting setup. So as you can imagine, having to move this manually to the other side and rotate it is a lot of work. So what I want to do is hit Shift C to make sure that my cursor is centered in the world underneath our bottle. And if I hit Shift A, I can add in what's called an empty. Now in other programs such as Adobe or 3D programs, this might be known as a null. And it doesn't actually have anything to it, so we're just going to use a sphere in this case. I can scale that up. And if we go to render it, you'll see nothing appears for that null because it's just a placeholder of sorts. It's kind of like an empty group. So what we can do in our outliner here, if I just open this a bit, we can grab our lamp and we can take the icon, click it and drag it, and you'll see drop to set parent. So we're going to parent our lamp to our empty here. Now if I select the empty and I rotate it on the Z, you see I can actually move my lamp all the way around my little jar here, or my little bottle. So if I enter into the preview mode here, you can see I can actually move that light all the way around. So this is really useful for being able to control lights. So I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this light rig _01. And of course, light _01. And this will be nice if you have to hand off this file to somebody. They'll appreciate you taking the time to name the individual components here. We already have our bottle, and of course we can name the plane floor if we really want to, or table, or whatever this is. But it's always good to make sure you're naming your files, follow your naming conventions. If you're working at a company, they will most likely have a specific way they want you to name all of your files. So make sure you're following along with that. All right, so what we can do now is we can rotate this light. Maybe at this angle, we can create a duplicate of this. So if we hit Shift D, we'll create a duplicate of our null or our empty. Do the same thing with the light, Shift D, right click to reset it back to its original position. So now we have the second light rig and our second light. Let's just parent that again. Let's rename it to be consistent. So that's light rig 02. 02. Now if we know that this one is going to exist on the right side, this one is going to be moved to the left side, maybe we can append L at the end of this and an R at the end of this, so that way we can kind of sort out exactly what direction things are facing in. Again, these are just little naming conventions that I use to be helpful to myself. So now we can see that we have this nice bottle that's being lit from the sides, and that's pretty good. I'm not really in love with the highlights that we're getting from the reflection of each of these lights, and they're a little intense. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch this. I'm going to move this light down. And I happen to know a couple of tricks about lighting, just due to my tenure previously as an amateur photographer and then also working in 3D, needing to move lights in a certain way. So I happen to know that if you rotate this light, whoops, not too much now, like this, we can get a nice rim light effect here to add some contrast to our edge, which just separates out the edge of our bottle from the kind of neutral gray background. Let's try to angle that up just a little bit more, maybe bring it down a little bit more. We do have to be careful about how much light is coming and hitting this edge of our plane there. But you can see now we're getting some nice effects here. We have a good amount of contrast. There's quite a bit of intrigue to this bottle, and we can easily tell what the outline of the form is for the most part. I can also scale this up a little bit, maybe rotate it like this. And there we go, we have that nice outline there, and then the light over here. We could add a third light to add some additional hits here or on the top of the rim. Maybe if we angle down, yeah, we can see we're already getting plenty of light. So a 3-light setup is pretty common for most things. It's called a 3-point light setup. We're not going to be using one of those right now because we are actually doing pretty well with just 2. But keep in mind that if you want to know more about that, you can feel free to search it up or ask me about it. I'll be happy to tell you about it. I kind of want to make this just a little bit bigger, just to soften up the light hit that's happening here. And I don't want to overblow this surface here. I can actually perhaps just increase this by 2000. And there we go. We have this nice hit here. And there's some nice kind of muted reflections on this side of the glass. So that's a pretty decent lighting setup, I will say. And say we're happy with that. Now let's talk about getting our camera in place. Well, our camera's down here, and so if we zoom into that, you can see, oh, that's not a very helpful view to just take this bottom part. So of course you could select your camera and move it manually. And of course that's, not the most intuitive way of doing things. Say you found a view up here that you really like something like this, and you want to move your camera to this view. Well, you can hit Control Alt and 0. And now your camera has moved into the location you were at. Of course, we might need to draw this camera back. So if we tap G, click in the middle mouse button and let go. Now if we move our mouse back, we can actually scroll our mouse directly back from what we're looking at. And then if we're happy with that, we can click. I'm actually going to undo that, and I'll show you why. If we come over to our properties panel here and click on the camera button, we can see all of our render statistics and information. So the most important thing we should pay attention to is this resolution box here. Make sure that they're set to our desired resolution. So for this project, I said 1080 by 1080 was good. And now we can see that our composition is open and it's probably going to work quite well. Yep, I think that's good. We could maybe zoom in a little bit more. So let me just grab that camera and we'll use the same thing, G, click in the middle mouse button and scroll forward just a little bit. There we go. So it's not the most exciting composition, but it certainly shows the object off. The other important thing we need to focus on is make sure that this percentage here is set to 100% instead of 50. It's by default set to 50. And what that'll do is that'll give us a render resolution of 540 by 540. We don't want that. I know I mentioned it in class, but I'll mention it again here just to make sure that everyone understands that. For me, I'm going to change my device to GPU. Don't worry if you don't have this. This just is specific to my machine. I don't believe that we need to do this on the lab computers because they don't have a GPU that supports GPU rendering. They're using a different model there, but the CPUs in the lab are very powerful, so feel free to use them. And then if we want the best render quality, we can come down to sampling and change our sampling presets to final. And that's about all you need to change in order to get a good render out of Blender. Now, if you are using the 2.79 version at home or somewhere else, feel free to come over to the Render Layer tab and click on Denoising. And what that does is, as you can see, this is rendering a preview out at 144 path tracing samples. Don't worry what that means. That's just, it's sampling all the areas in here and giving us pixels where it thinks they should be. And the more samples we give it, the better the image is going to appear. But essentially, you can still see that there's these little speckles everywhere, and that's just called noise. If we turn on our denoising, when we go to do our final render, it will get rid of all that noise for us. So I'm going to click this render button. You'll notice that Blender has switched us from a 3D view and into a UV image editor. And it's starting to render that image that we told it to render. So I'm just going to let it do its thing, and I will resume the video when it's done, and we'll talk about where to go from there. Alright, now that our render has finished, we can take a look and give it a quick review. We can see that everything is pretty well lit. There's a little bit of a hotspot here, but it's not too bad. I think it defines the edge of our bottle. I would probably go back and just tune that light a little bit to make sure it wasn't so overblown. Of course, we could take this further by putting a texture on the table and in the background, as well as possibly putting a label on our bottle, maybe mixing up the materials a bit. But for the most part, this definitely demonstrates the depth of what we covered in the class, at least to a more polished degree. Of course, you know, I'm obviously very familiar with 3D. So if you don't get something that's exactly like this, that's okay. I know that you're all still learning. I have no doubt in my mind that if you keep practicing, you could do this and well beyond this. For sure. But if you're interested in checking out more material workflow and understanding how to put textures on things, take a look out for that mailbox tutorial that'll be on YouTube pretty soon. I'm uploading it shortly, and that'll have the file and everything with it along with the materials. And you'll be able to see exactly how to put together your materials. If you combine that with all the other material we've learned and just keep practicing it and keep using all the resources available to you to increase the amount of knowledge you have about Blender, I have no doubt that you could be well on your way to being very good at 3D. So now with that said, if we're happy with our image, which I think this is fine, we can go down to the image button here and say save as image. Of course, we're going to save it after ourselves, last name _ first name. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we have some save as image options here. We have PNG settings. I would leave these the same. You can also save it as a JPEG if you'd like. Just make sure your quality is set to 100%. I'm going to save it as a PNG because I don't like lossless files like JPEG. So I'll just keep these settings fine, and I will save my image. We can check to make sure. This one here, named after ourselves, of course, and Cropwell _ Kevin.png, named after myself. So I'm going to move that out of the way. So now if you remember, when we hit the render button, Blender brought us into a UV image editor. Let's go into the 3D view now. So here we have our scene, our beautiful scene with our camera and everything in it. Now, if you'll recall, I need you to take a screenshot of your wireframe. So turn everything else off except for the geometry you worked on. Head into wireframe mode with Z. You can also switch into that using this viewport shading mode here into wireframe, of course. Make sure that the geometry is unselected. If you have modifiers attached to this, which I did previously, and I used a little bit of movie magic to turn that off while we were rendering. But if you do have a modifier on and you'd like me to review your work, I would suggest zooming in so that I can see your work and taking maybe 2 or 3 screenshots like this. And if not, if you can get back and allow me to see it, I think right about here isn't so bad, although we are missing some information at the top and bottom, so we'd probably have to zoom out to about there. I can enter into fly mode and just kind of nudge ourselves forward a little bit. Try to get as much of that screen space used up. So that isn't too awful. I can pretty well see what's going on here in terms of the wireframe. Let's just turn off that modifier, and of course you can see now it's a lot easier for me to make sense of what I'm looking at. So once you're happy with how your wireframes are, I'm going to open up the snipping tool, which is this really cool tool on Windows that just lets me take screenshots. I can draw out a little box here and just take a screenshot of this. I can right click, save as, and of course we're going to name it after ourselves, and we can say _WF1 for wireframe 1, or you can write out wireframe if you want, but WF1 works here. And then if we have more than one, of course 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Don't give me more than 6, please. That's a little excessive, but 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 should probably cover it, but I'm only making it required that you send 1, so we'll do the 1. So now if we want to look at exporting our geometry, let's do that. So we'll switch into solid mode. Make sure your bottle is selected or your object is selected. File, export, and if it would open, there we go. Wavefront OBJ, and then of course name it after yourself, put it in your own folder, and note that we have a bunch of presets over here. Make sure you have selection only ticked on. If you have any modifiers, you can apply them using this button here. Now if you have a subsurf modifier on your object, I would suggest just turning it off or taking it off and untick this, because I want to see your base geometry. I can always add a subsurf modifier onto it when I review it. So make sure that if you need a subsurf modifier, you make a note of it inside of your text document, which will describe the project to me. And the rest of these settings are okay. Again, the scale setting here is for those of you who are getting ready to 3D print or who have already 3D printed. I think it's a little late at this time, but keep in mind that that can be changed if you need it there. Leave it by default if you're just uploading online or sending your project files to me. It's perfectly fine the way it is. Sketchfab is really good at interpreting sizes. So if you have any upload problems inside of Sketchfab, however, make sure you come and look at this setting here. If it's a sizing issue, then possibly this could need a change, but I don't think so. I think Sketchfab is pretty good at interpreting these sizes. So once you're happy with all those settings there, just hit the Export OBJ button, and we have our files. You'll notice that the OBJ export will actually create an MTL file, and this sometimes has material information about your object. It's not necessary. I didn't require this, but you can leave it there. That's perfectly fine. No worries about that. Sometimes it can come in handy for me, but again, not mandatory. And then once we've done that, of course, we need to come in here and write our half-page text document. So I like to use a TXT document. You can, of course, include a Word document or even a PDF if you want to get fancy. So name it after yourself. And then in this document, you need to include a description about your project, what it's supposed to be, what you thought about it, what inspired your process, things you learned, things you were challenged by, things you would have liked to have done to it, or plans to expand it if possible. Of course, include the link to your online upload in this text document, or create a separate text document for that if you'd like to really bring attention to it. That's perfectly fine, but make sure that that link is in here somewhere. Include it with your work. You could also include any other works that you've done, put them in a PDF. So if you have sketches or progress, screenshots, things like that, organize them in a PDF and throw them in here. Of course, name that after yourself as usual, and make sure that everything is in its proper order. Once you've included all of these things together, you can come to the desktop or wherever you save this file and right click and zip it up. So once that's done getting zipped up, you can send that off to Kirby and he will review it and send it to me. Of course, if you want to save the blend file, which is optional, you can also do that. So I'll just do that really quickly. And we can see in here, there's our blend file. So again, once you have everything here, just zip it up and send it off to Kirby. Make sure that you name everything after yourself. I'm going to say that one more time, because if you don't, we're going to act like we never received anything and you're not going to get a grade, or you might get a 0 for the project. And I don't want that to happen. I want you to have a good time. I want you to get a good grade and get some good feedback and be well on your way to being an awesome designing artist, you know, creative, entrepreneurial, whatever it is you want to be. So make sure that your files and everything else are lined up properly and named after what they need to be named after, and then send that off to Kirby before Sunday at 7 p.m., which is your deadline. So if you do 3D prints, by the way, bring those to class on Monday. Of course, we'll review them with the rest of the work. And I hope that this has given you a good insight. We looked at lights, we looked at cameras, we looked at rendering, we looked at exporting. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ask me. I, of course, am holding lab at 10:30 on Friday until whenever students no longer need me. Of course, I'll have to draw some kind of limit if we're there for, like, 6 hours or something. That might be a little excessive, but I'll play it by ear and see who needs what and do my best to address everyone's needs. So I hope to see you there if you need some help, and if not, I hope you have a great weekend, and I'm looking forward to critiquing all the work on Monday. And then, of course, for those of you who are interested in material design inside of Blender and understanding how all that works with textures and materials, take a look out for that mailbox tutorial, which I'm uploading shortly. It'll include a bunch of textures and materials that are inside of Blender, along with the mailbox file that I put together before the class started, and you can take a look at that, deconstruct it, get an idea of how it works. So keep an eye out for that. It's coming shortly, and I hope this all finds you well, and take care.